In the year 1720, behind the sealed gates of the Forbidden City, a 15-year-old girl steps into a world that promises honor but delivers chains. The emperor's concubines lived under rules so bizarre, so cruel, that every movement, every breath, every glance meant the difference between life and death. These were not rituals of love, but codes of survival crafted to strip women of their voices, their names, even their very humanity. Tonight, you will hear the rules of the harem that history tried to bury. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, hit like, and listen until the end. This story will reveal secrets hidden for centuries. The year was 1720. Inside the labyrinthine passages of the Forbidden City, a girl of 15 followed an aging eunuch through a narrow corridor. The walls glowed with imperial yellow, but the air carried a strange mixture of jasmine incense and quiet dread. Her silk slippers made no sound on the polished stone floor, yet every step seemed to echo in her chest. She had just been chosen as one of the emperor's new concubines, and the weight of that word pressed upon her like an invisible shackle. The eunuch stopped suddenly, his shadow trembling in the flicker of a candle. When he turned, his eyes reflected both pity and a cold detachment. He leaned close and whispered, "Listen carefully, child. What I am about to tell you will decide whether you live or die in this place." His voice was so soft it barely rose above the faint trickle of water from unseen fountains. Her pulse quickened. She had been raised to imagine life in the harem as a paradise of silk and jewels, where beauty was rewarded with honor. But the eunuch's words told another story, one of invisible chains, rules stranger and more terrifying than anything she had known. The first rule was simple in words but dreadful in practice. A concubine must never, under any circumstance, turn her back to the emperor. Not while walking, not while undressing, not even in the most intimate of moments. She must always face him, always keep her movements aligned to his gaze. Women who survived in this world learned to glide like dancers, pivoting and bending with unnatural grace so that their spines never once betrayed them. Why such a rule? Because absolute power breeds absolute suspicion. An emperor ruling over hundreds of millions lived with constant fear. Fear of poison hidden beneath a fingernail, of a needle concealed in silk, of betrayal arriving from the hands meant to please him. To turn one's back was to offer the possibility of death. As the eunuch's whisper faded, the girl felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Luxury and honor had been a lie. Survival here would demand something far more dangerous: the art of disappearing into obedience. In the days that followed her arrival, the girl began to understand that the corridor whisper had been only the beginning. More rules awaited, each one crafted not merely to restrain her body but to dissolve her very sense of self. The second rule came swiftly. As sharp and unforgiving as a blade, she was never to speak unless spoken to, and even then, her words could not carry the simple pronoun of I. She was no longer herself. She was this unworthy servant, this lowly concubine. Phrases drilled into her tongue until they became second nature. The language stripped away her name, her childhood, even her memories of family. The emperor did not share his chambers with human beings. He received vessels, objects crafted for his desire. By forcing her to speak in the third person, the palace erased her identity before her life had even begun. The effect was insidious. At first, she stumbled over the strange phrasing, her voice catching as she tried to reshape familiar words into alien constructions. But within weeks, she found her thoughts shifting. Even alone, she no longer thought of herself as I. She was fragments. A being referred to in the distance. Other women in the harem confessed, in hushed whispers, that the same thing had happened to them. Months of silence and ritual speech rewired their minds. They no longer dreamed as themselves. They dreamed as nameless slaves. The third rule cut even deeper. A concubine must never meet the emperor's eyes during intimacy. Her gaze had to remain fixed on the hollow space just beneath his chin. Averted eyes meant submission, but it also served another purpose. It denied the possibility of seeing the truth. If she looked into his eyes, she might glimpse not a son of heaven but a lonely, fearful man desperate to prove his divinity through domination. and if he looked into hers, he might see pain, intelligence, or rebellion, dangerous sparks that could not be allowed to exist. To violate this rule was to risk exile to the eunuch's quarters, a fate worse than death. And so she trained herself, staring endlessly at that empty space below his chin, learning to erase her gaze, as surely as she had erased her name. The girl soon discovered that the rule of the eyes was not a mere formality but a weapon designed to shatter the soul. Within the harem, women moved with practiced precision, their gazes lowered like obedient shadows. They could look at his robes, his hands, even his mouth, but never at the throne of his gaze. The risk was too great. To meet the emperor's eyes, even by accident, was to cross into forbidden territory. A single slip could destroy years of careful survival. The punishment was not death. Death was swift, merciful, final. Instead, the violator was cast into a living grave, sent to the quarters of the eunuchs. There, stripped of status and dignity, she existed as a warning to others, her presence a ghostly reminder that desire for equality was more dangerous than poison. The girl watched an older concubine falter only once. During a late-night summons, exhaustion betrayed her. Her eyes lifted instinctively, just for a heartbeat, and met the emperor's. Silence fell like a blade. She fell to her knees at once, forehead pressed against the cold floor, begging forgiveness for the sin of presumption. The emperor said nothing, but days later, she vanished from women's chambers. Whispers spread quickly. She now lived among the eunuchs, her beauty wasted, her voice silenced. The other concubines learned their lesson well. The cruelty of the rule lay not only in punishment but in what it denied. Eye contact was a mirror of humanity. To look into another's eyes was to acknowledge shared existence. To risk seeing fear or longing or fragility. The emperor could not allow that. He must take without recognizing, possess without seeing. For him, their gaze was a threat. For them, his eyes were a dangerous truth they must never face. And so, the girl learned to anchor her vision on the hollow of his throat. It became her horizon, the fixed point around which she constructed every gesture. Her eyes grew heavy from restraint, her neck stiff from forced control. She moved as if her own soul had been cut away, leaving only the mask of obedience. The fourth rule revealed itself as the most haunting of all. In the emperor's bedchamber, silence was not a courtesy but a commandment. A concubine was forbidden to utter a sound unless he demanded it. Her voice, her breath, even the smallest gasp, had to be held under his authority. The expectation was absolute. Every trace of her body's reaction belonged to him, and him alone. For the young concubine, this was a torment unlike any other. At first, she struggled to restrain the natural rhythm of her body. A cry of pain, a startled breath, a trembling exhale, all these betrayed a will beyond the emperor's control. To show that she could feel without his permission was to risk punishment, and so she learned to suppress everything, to bury her responses deep inside her chest until she felt herself hollowing out. The harem became a stage where women performed the impossible art of voiceless desire. They bit their tongues until blood welled, clenched their jaws until their heads throbbed. Some held their breath so long they fainted. Others perfected a dreadful stillness, their faces masks carved from obedience. The emperor, intoxicated by this spectacle, often turned the silence into a game. He would test them with sudden gestures, cruel pinches, or drawn-out torments, waiting to see if he could force a sound from lips trained to remain shut. The cruelest outcome was not the physical pain but what followed. Over time, some women lost the ability to make sound at all. They became living ghosts, their voices stolen by obedience. Even alone, even when no eyes watched them, they remained mute, prisoners of their own bodies. Palace physicians could give no explanation. To the eunuchs, it was proof of divine order, the emperor's will etched permanently into flesh. The girl listened to these stories, whispered by older concubines in hushed corners. She touched her own throat in fear, imagining it closing forever. She understood now that silence was more than a rule, it was the theft of her very humanity. In time, the girl learned of another rule, one that revealed the emperor's most carefully guarded obsession. It was not enough to control her movements, her words, her voice. He also demanded dominion over the rhythm of her very body. The fifth rule declared that his climax must always come last. At first glance, this seemed to echo the ancient idea of a considerate lover, but here, there was nothing tender in the decree. It had nothing to do with her pleasure, and everything to do with cosmic order. The emperor's release was seen as sacred, a reaffirmation of his mandate from heaven. For a concubine to reach her peak before him was unthinkable. It suggested that mortal desire could outpace divine will. This demand created an endless calculation inside the women. They became watchers of his breath, readers of his skin, interpreters of every twitch and sigh. Their own bodies had to be silenced just as their voices were. Some concubines learned to distract themselves with poems, silently reciting verses as their bodies trembled beneath him. Others calculated sums or rehearsed memories of childhood, anything to anchor themselves against the pull of sensation. Yet the cruelty did not end with timing. The sixth rule governed what came after, and it was here that humiliation reached its sharpest edge. When the emperor finished, the woman was forbidden to move. She had to remain exactly as she was, prostrate, exposed, marked by the evidence of his use, until he gave permission to rise. Sometimes minutes passed, sometimes hours. In those frozen moments she was reduced to an object, no different from the silken draperies or the carved screens that surrounded the bed. He could wash, dress, summon attendants, or even call for another concubine. She, meanwhile, was locked in stillness, her muscles screaming, her dignity dissolving into the stone floor. The girl soon understood. In this palace, even after desire was spent, the theater of submission continued. Intimacy was never hers to claim. It was ceremony, ritual, proof that her body belonged not to herself but to the empire. The girl had begun to think she understood the rules, but the next revelation struck deeper than any before. It was not about movement, speech, or silence. It was about the fragile mystery of her own body. The seventh rule declared that if a concubine even suspected she might be pregnant, she was bound to report it at once to the head eunuch, not to the emperor, never to him directly, but to those who managed his hidden empire. The danger lay in uncertainty. A woman who delayed reporting risked execution for concealing a potential heir, yet a woman who reported falsely faced a beating so severe it carved scars into her skin. This left every concubine in a constant state of terror. They watched themselves obsessively, reading every flicker of appetite, every ache, every moment of exhaustion. Their bodies became battlegrounds of vigilance, sources not of joy but of dread. Some developed elaborate methods of tracking. Secret calendars scratched into the wooden beams of their quarters. Coded conversations whispered during baths. Even the study of dreams, as if the unconscious might betray a hidden truth. But there was no safety in these precautions. Mistakes were inevitable. And mistakes meant punishment. Confirmed pregnancies offered no relief. The concubine was immediately isolated, cut off from the women who had once been her companions. Guards and attendants hovered constantly, not to protect her but to ensure she did nothing to interfere with the precious life within. She was no longer regarded as a person but as a vessel, a container for a potential heir. The girl listened as older women spoke of these months of confinement, long corridors of silence, meals monitored, movements restricted. Some wept for freedom. Others prayed desperately for miscarriage, knowing such thoughts were forbidden. A child might mean honor, but it also meant scrutiny so suffocating that life itself felt suspended. For the first time, the girl realized that even within her own body, she possessed nothing. Not her name, not her voice, not her gaze, and not even the possibility of motherhood. Everything belonged to the emperor, to the dynasty, to the endless machinery of power. The girl soon discovered that no encounter with the emperor was ever truly private. The 12th rule revealed the presence of silent witnesses, sometimes eunuchs, sometimes senior concubines. They lingered in the shadows, eyes sharp, pens ready to record. Their task was not to please the emperor but to ensure obedience. Every breath, every movement, every flicker of expression could be judged. A misplaced glance, a murmur of genuine feeling, a tremor of defiance, any of these could be reported. The women never knew when they were being observed, so they lived as if eyes were always upon them. The next cruelty came disguised as generosity. The 13th rule governed gifts. The emperor occasionally bestowed jewels, silks, or delicacies upon his women. But such tokens carried invisible chains. To accept a gift was to accept a debt that could never be repaid. Gratitude had to be performed endlessly, not just for the present itself, but for the honor of having been noticed. Worse still, gifts became tools of division. A necklace around one woman's throat meant resentment in another's heart. Refusing a gift, however, was unthinkable. An insult that could not be forgiven. The 14th rule stretched far beyond the walls of the forbidden city. A concubine's family was bound to her fate. Relatives became hostages in all but name. Their reputations and futures held ransom to her obedience. If she displeased the emperor, it was not only her own body that paid the price. Brothers could lose their careers, sisters their marriages, parents their honor. A single misstep could ruin generations. The girl carried this knowledge like a stone in her chest. Her survival was not hers alone, but her family's as well. Then came the 15th rule, the most inevitable of all age. In a world where beauty was currency, time itself became the cruelest enemy. The women were expected to fade gracefully but not visibly, to remain desirable without appearing desperate. Dangerous cosmetics, laced with lead, scarred their skin. Starvation rituals hollowed their bodies. They smiled through pain, knowing each day brought them closer to replacement. The girl, still young, wondered how long before her own face began its slow betrayal. The final rules of the harem were whispered with the heaviest weight, for they spoke not of life within the palace, but of its grim aftermath. The 16th rule declared that when an emperor died, his concubines faced a choice that was no choice at all. Some were expected to follow him into the grave, entombed alive beside his body as proof of eternal devotion. Others were left to live on as widows, forbidden to remarry or bear children, their lives stretched into hollow years of silence. The harem taught its women to prepare for death long before it arrived, composing poems of loyalty, writing farewells to their families, practicing the serenity of sacrifice. Yet even in such despair, resistance found roots. The 17th rule was never spoken by eunuchs or inscribed in scrolls. It lived in secret gestures among the women themselves. A flower arranged in an unusual pattern, a song hummed just off key, a fleeting glance that lingered too long, these became their hidden languages. Some attempted bolder rebellions, smuggling letters beyond the walls, plotting escape, even taking their own lives in defiance rather than submission. Few succeeded, but each act was a spark against the darkness, proof that the spirit could not be fully extinguished. The 18th rule was the cruelest paradox of all. Love. A concubine was forbidden from loving the emperor, yet required to perform love so perfectly that it could never be questioned. To feel too much was, and to risk destruction, to feel nothing at all, was to lose the last remnants of her humanity. Many faltered on this razor's edge, either consumed by forbidden devotion or emptied into numbness. And then came the end. The 19th and 20th rules revealed the truth. When an emperor died, the women who had served him became burdens to the new dynasty. Some were sent to temples as nuns, others vanished without record, and the rest lived as shadows, reminders of power's fragility. The survivors carried invisible scars, their memories buried yet never erased. Years later, the girl, now older, hardened, almost unrecognizable, stood once more in the candlelit corridor. Another trembling child waited before her, eyes wide with naive hope. The cycle demanded continuation. And so, with a voice heavy with centuries, she began to whisper the rules, binding yet another life to the endless chain of power and submission. Tell me in the comments, which rule shocked you the most? I read every response and love seeing how these forgotten stories strike different people. If you want more hidden stories of history, subscribe, like, and watch the next video, because the past holds darker secrets than you can imagine.